let's go back to something, because you've all touched on it. After Kossuth said that art is dependent on language, he added that in this shift from the perceptual to the mental, his words, if a viewer doesn't have an intellectual interest, a physical or perceptual one is desired. Now, April was talking about being, at heart, maybe a conceptualist, and there being a lot of thought. Are the perceptual and the intellectual, I mean, why assume that the perceptual and the intellectual are mutually exclusive? Isn't there, in good art, isn't there always thought?
But that's what I was trying to say,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
I think that that would describe me to a certain extent, depending on your definition of intellectual, but I'm certainly not conceptual. And you know, it occurs to me while we're talking, there's one other category of art that seems to be emerging, and actually started with Warhol, where you get another kind of puckish inversion of conceptual, which is culture navel-gazing in a kind of a Klein bodily way. So you get art that's so about the culture, and culture that's so about the art, and then the celebration of the isolationist aspect of the art world, which is now the art market, and the way that that all celebrates itself. And it's a really, I mean, I'm squinching up my face because I find it like in many cases a particularly kind of unsavory direction that I find really annoying, just because it asks me to allow for a lot of what I consider incredibly sophomoric expression to be taken seriously, and I find it very difficult. And I don't know how to categorize that, frankly. Do you have a...
On the other hand, you can have art that indeed is very emotional, as you found in abstract expressionism, whether it be Rothko or de Kooning or you name it. And then you can have art that really is just interesting. As Donald Judd said, it's sufficient for art to be interesting. And I can't see why art can't be both.
Yeah.
Well, presumably good art is both.
Well, I
But-
mean, why art can't be just appeal to the intellect and just be interesting, as much of Judd's work is, and certainly as much of Wiener's work is.
Well, I would just like to shift to something that Irving said about the distinction, which I agree with you, there's a subjective and objective. You mentioned Johns and Rauschenberg.
Yes.
Okay? I think Johns valorizes himself through signifiers. For example, he has that can with his paintbrushes in it.
Yes,
Okay?
he does.
He has the screen door from a place he lived in, so he's there. He's there. A sign of Johns. Do we know it's Johns? Rauschenberg's, a lot of his work deals with his experience in Galveston. He has images in his last group of big photographs of places he'd been in the South. He's always aware of that. So there is always some sense of the self that's going there.
Yes, there is.
Okay, so I think it may be an attenuated sense of the self, but it's there. It's not been given up. Okay, if you go to minimalism, you think of Carl Andre's flat pieces of metal. You're allowed to walk in them. That is, you're allowed to get subjectively involved. So there's an implicit sense that you are there, okay? So it's not escape, you can't escape it entirely, but it's very attenuated, it's hinted at, and in a sense it's valorized. It's valorizing the self as an anonymous figure. And that might be the way to go to it, although in the case of Johns and Rauschenberg, it's grounded in their own very particular experiences.
But couldn't you say that about conceptual art as well?
Yes.
That there is a subjective dimension in it?
I'm agreeing with you, and the subjective dimension is paradoxically the kind of hatred of expressionism that you find. That's the subjective dimension. The hatred of painting, that's the subjective.
No, I'm talking
Their
about a
negativity.
sense of the conceptual artist as he presents himself, in the case of Wiener, for example.
Well, yes, okay, but the question is what that self is. Okay, the question of what, I think it's an attenuated, very attenuated sense of the self compared to the whole idea that you can find of the self, say, going back to Goya's The Sleep of Reason, the sense of the unconscious emerging. So it's a very attenuated, sense of the self as an empty signifier, I would say, or a non-specific signifier in some sense, although there's some specificity. So yes, it is there, and they're hanging on to that. That's one thing I would say. I would give you that there is always some hint of, quote, self, but it's very abstract.
Very abstract.
Very abstract. Now, when you use the word interesting, okay, I honestly don't know what that means in the context that Judge is talking about, because there's all kinds of things that are interesting, okay? You're interesting.
Thank you.
You really are. You're interesting. The word interesting.
Convince my wife of that.
Oh, I think she's been with you a long time. She must be convinced. Yeah. But my point is that the word interesting, as Judd uses it, is again almost meaningless. Almost meaningless. It's not interesting the way you're interesting, or even the way this glass of water is interesting. The word interest has lost its, let's call it its bite, its interest always in something. Interest is always a relational term, and the question is, what is Judd's work interested in? And I think what Judge has simply is a kind of reduced to a kind of self-identical work, which is absolutely vacuous. And I think if anybody achieves the lack of self, the lack of subjectivity, I think it's Judd that does it, myself.
But it was a very interesting move in art. It was original, it was fresh. This is interesting, right here. We are ships at sea, not ducks in a pond.
Okay,
It's an interesting idea.
yeah, but do I need it presenting itself as a work of art?
No, over here not, but when he does it on the wall and does it very artfully, that makes it even more interesting. I don't know if you need it, I don't need it, but I can understand that this is an interesting idea.
Okay, not as interesting as a crossword puzzle.
I don't do crossword puzzles.
But you know, it's nice to put it on a wall, and you get credit for being an artist, okay? And there's some cachet in being an artist, okay?
No, it's more serious than
I don't
that.
think it is. I really don't think it is.
Because
Not much more serious.
Because
It's
it
not
can-
telling us things we don't know already.
maybe things you don't know, but there was a whole generation of artists who really became very enamored with this approach to art and did some rather remarkable things with it. Minimalist and post-minimalist art. Can't deny that.
I cannot deny that. They did, quote, interesting things from the perspective of the development of art in the United States at a certain time, okay?
Yes.
From that perspective, I would not deny that. But I would say in terms of the larger perspective that they're claiming for themselves, that is intellectuality, I think is trivial. They have been criticized by philosophers. There's a whole text that philosophers written about Kossuth claiming to be philosophical, and I think they want to be schoolmasters. Kossuth has an exhibition now at the Philadelphia Museum, you know, where it's like a blackboard, and it reminds me of Boyce's blackboards, you know, and they want to educate us, to teach us. And then I always ask myself, you know, what is their credential for that? They're working out a system. Are they philosophers? It's not exactly clear that they're theoretically competent. Okay, that's what I would
What does
argue.
that mean?
What does it mean to be theoretical competence? It means to work out a
You
system, to
have
carry
to
your idea.
write papers and get A's? I don't understand.
No, you have to
that.
carry an idea out to its consequences.
Which they've done.
I'm not sure that they do.
They've really made art as object-like as they could make it, thing-like, which is
Oh,
what
you're
they
talking
set
about
out
something
to
different.
do.
You're talking about the object like. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No,
No,
that's about.
we interrupted April.
Yeah, we did.
You did?
We got us off the hook.
Artists always have the last word.
But before you do, April, you have to understand, Donald, that this is entirely your subjective,
Oh, no, it's an art historical and intellectual historical argument. It's not.
Because I
This
can-
whole idea of the dissociation of sensibility has been tracked right through the modern period.
yeah,
You can find
but
it in
your
literature.
your put down of these artists is very personal, it's your personal. Of course, I can
No.
point to artists that you have supported that are far inferior to these minimal
Well, you see,
artists.
I think in a quite different way than you do about that. I don't think in terms of the inferior or superior. I think of what are they getting at, what is the context of meaning, how are they articulating it.
It's
So,
interesting.
Yes, there's a consistent way. What you are doing is tracking the movement, and you're celebrating them, and you've done a brilliant job of that. That's fine. What I'm interested in is the claims that they make for themselves, how they fit in the larger cultural and intellectual discourse of society. Okay.
While-
April?
Go ahead. April, did you want to?
Seriously? I just keep thinking that I respect all movements of art. I respect sometimes certain artists more than others. If I think about comparing Kossuth with Beuys, I mean, Beuys is such a romantic, and I tend to like the more romantic ones. What can I say? But because I feel like his psyche is spilling over into his work. I mean, no one understands those chalkboards.
Yeah,
They're 100%
Right.
absolutely incomprehensible. But then they end up being sort of beautiful objects because they have an intensity about them that you're left with. And if you don't speak German, you're off the hook. But I tend to, I mean, everything is subjective for me. Art is incredibly subjective, but as cultural phenomena representing certain times that we're all passing through and trying to wrestle with. I mean, I'm also constantly met with the frustration of art development as this kind of linear notion. I mean, in a way, the plurality that's extant now is a relief to me because I'm so tired of like making progress. I mean,
Right.
art and progress is so ridiculous.
That's over.
Actually, I was going to
Thank
ask you
God.
about that.